Hello everyone, welcome back to D Squared Stories, an audio fiction podcast bringing you short serialized weekly stories. This week we are getting right back into the Immortal love, so without any further ado, let's get a quick recap and get started. Last time, Heather and Ron went to the art museum together after Ron got the news that human trials on his drug, titled Amrita, had begun. Heather showed Ron an appreciation for art, and the two talked more about the nature of immortality and love. In a series of questions meant to trip her up and reveal why her father had set her on a path to meet Ron, Heather managed to reveal nothing, other than the fact that she did not approve of Ron's mustache. After seeing a disturbing painting that reminded Heather of her fear of dying alone, they witnessed as one of Heather's students collapsed, similar to how Heather had done in the past. It was revealed a water contamination had given him an irreversible liver condition. Ron conspicuously gave his mother a bottle of Amrita to give to him. When the two returned to Ron's childhood house, they were ambushed by a gunman who told Ron he was going to die. Chapter 4. The Penthouse. The agitated man in a mask continued pointing the gun at Ron. Heather had shrieked in fear on seeing the weapon and trembled in the corner. Ron, for his part, only seemed greatly inconvenienced and annoyed by this. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Money? Favors? I'm worth more alive than dead, I can promise you that much." "I want you dead for what you did to me," he said. With his free hand, he pulled his mask down and off his face. He was a white, blond man with a sharp jaw and smooth features. He looked to be about 28, with bright blue eyes. Ron had never seen him before in his whole life, and the dramatic face reveal only served to confuse him. "Good grief, kid," he said. "No offense, but am I supposed to know who you are now?" "What are you doing?" Heather asked desperately. The gunman growled furiously at this, glaring at Ron. "Figures. You ruin my life and get me fired from my job, and all the while you don't even know who I am," he said. "Benny Russell, food and drug scientist from the agency. The one you had your senator friend help get rid of?" Ron's eyes widened a bit, and he nodded his head. Right, he said. "Mr. Russell, my apologies. I do know the name, just not the face. It was never my intention to get you fired, merely reassigned off my product." "You say that like it's supposed to be a good thing. I was the only thing standing in the way of your snake oil of a pill from the general public." Ron chuckled. "Snake oil? Well, I'd say that's not." "Shut your mouth!" Benny pointed the gun again at Ron, who seemed to only roll his eyes at this escalation. "I'm sick of your voice. You're a conniving con artist of a businessman who schmoozes his way through every tough situation. Your pill isn't only fake. It's dangerous to anyone who doesn't want their liver going into hyperdrive and burning their body out." Ron, unsure of anything he could say helping, turned his glance to Heather briefly to see she was still nervously cowering in the corner. The sound of the electric kettle still rumbled as it brought the water back to boiling. Benny's eyes twitched a bit. "Hey, eyes over here, pig." Ron sighed. "What do you want from me? Do you want me to call off the trial? Go back to the drawing board? I'll do it. If you convince me that this thing is really not going to work and it's going to hurt people, I've never been about doing that." Benny bit his lip in frustration. "Liar! Your whole career you've only stomped on people who got in your way. Even if I call it off, expose you, you're so slippery you'll just end up doing it again. I have to take the only thing I know you're afraid of losing. Your life." He stepped forward and pointed the gun more towards Ron's head. Ron, still with his hands on his hips, just shook his head at him. "That's not why you're here," he said. "It sure is." "No, it's not," Ron said. "You're here because you felt powerless. You felt so powerless, and now you wanted to take it out on one of the most powerful men in the world, and make him feel the same way. Be a great equalizer, showing that despite everything, we're only a gunshot away from the same ground. But that's the thing, Mr. Russell. I don't feel powerless. Ever. That's the difference between us. You say I've taken everything from you? That's because you had things to take. You can take nothing from me." Benny growled again. "I think I can take your life," he said. "What would you do then?" "I'd die knowing I'd live forever as the man who created immortality." "You didn't!" Ron chuckled. "That's just it, Benny. I fully believe my own greatness is inevitable. If you kill me now, I'll die thinking that. Oh, and the Immortality Project won't stop. A good chunk of my fortune will go towards keeping it alive, per my will. So don't think you'll have gotten anything of what you wanted." Ron just stared and smirked at him. Benny shook with pure rage as he desperately thought of what to do to wipe the smile off his face. Inside, Ron's heart was pounding, but in his mind, the only way to win here was to win psychologically. If he could force Benny to crack under the pressure, it might just give him a chance to wrest the gun free. Benny, scanning the room, then pointed his gun at Heather. "Well, how about her then? How about I kill your lady friend first?" he asked. Heather screamed. Ron's face immediately contorted into a scowl. "She has nothing to do with this. She's done nothing wrong." Benny smiled deviously. "It seems like her death would make you upset. That's something I consider her to have done wrong. Endear herself to a maniac like you." "Maniac?" Ron asked. "You're the one pointing a gun at an innocent woman. You said I stop on anyone who's in my way? You're going to trample on someone who's not even in your path. How does that make you any better?" "Because I'm going to take something from you that matters today, Ron Young. And if this woman is the only thing that matters to you, then she's a consequence of a chain of actions that you set in motion with that immortality pill." Ron looked to Heather, who was still frozen with fear. He shook his head and gritted his teeth. With a pained expression, he sighed. "There's an emergency protocol," he said, "in case we ever got raided by the feds or some other government trying to steal the formula for the pills." Benny turned his attention back to Ron. He nodded as if to say to continue. "I just call into the on-call, give him my override code. He's able to wipe everything from the databases about Amrita. It's all digital, too, just to make sure no one could ever sneak anything out. You do that, the pill's gone, the project dead. 10 years of work, down the drain." "Then do it," Benny said, pointing the gun back at him. "I'll do it, but once I give the code, she gets to walk. It takes a few minutes for the sequence to run, so there's a chance I get to call it off if you back out." Benny looked over to Heather, then back to Ron. He nodded. "Make it happen. She can walk as soon as you give the code." Ron, sweating, dialed the number. He gritted his teeth in agitation. Heather looked on at him, still shocked but feeling the slightest bit relieved. The phone, being put on speaker, rang for a few seconds. It was picked up shortly after. "Hello, Mr. Young. This is the station security on-call. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Operation Rapture." There was a grim silence on the other end for a moment. "Sir, please provide your authentication code." "Adam, Mary, Raphael, Isaac, Timothy, Amos." "Thank you, sir. Rapture protocol is now being deployed." Ron looked away from the phone and stared right at Benny. Benny nodded towards Heather. Benny stepped from the doorway and deeper into the kitchen. Heather looked hesitant to leave at first, looking back at Ron in fear. "Go," he said. She shakily made her way out of the kitchen and into the living room. Out of the sight of them, the door to the outside could be heard closing. Ron let out a sigh of relief. The voice on the other end of the phone started to talk again. "Okay, sir. Rapture protocol is complete. Are there any other preparations we need to take?" he asked. "No, thank you," Ron said. He hung up the phone and slid it into his pocket. He looked genuinely agitated now. He stared back at Benny, who had not stopped pointing the gun at him for a moment. "Are you satisfied, Mr. Russell?" he said. "No innocent blood was spilled today, but the quest for immortality was set back by about 10 years. "You're still going to die today," Benny said coldly. "And don't delude yourself for a moment that one act of kindness for a woman is going to keep you from the fires of hell." "Don't you worry. God and I have never been on good terms. Certainly not now." Benny nodded. "All right. Sayonara, Mr. Young." "Stop it!" Heather cried out. She peeked her head from behind the doorway, never actually having left the house. Ron looked in a mix of awe and frustration as he still saw her in this dangerous situation. Benny looked back in shock before keeping his eyes trained on Ron again. "Get out of here. Last warning," Benny said. "You don't have to kill him. You stopped the project. What good does killing him do at this point?" she asked. "He said it himself. He thinks all this is inevitable. He's just going to try again. He's got another 10 years in him. He can recreate everything. He has no remorse or regard for anyone. And now in those 10 years, he'll know what to look out for, what you warned about. He won't create the same thing, even if there's only a small chance that it's going to backfire." "You give him too much credit. He doesn't care about people like you do. He's not like us." Heather sighed. She looked at Ron's face, still bewildered by the situation. "He's not perfect. We all know that to be true. He can be selfish, sarcastic, and arrogant. No one who knows him would ever object to that. But the few people who really know Ron know he's not evil. What evil person would give up their entire life's work for a woman they only met a few weeks ago?" Benny grunted angrily. Heather kept going. "Just leave here. If you shoot him, it won't be hard for the police to find you. If you shoot him, you're basically ending your own life too. You can leave here and have accomplished what you set out to do. Be happy that you did it without causing any unnecessary violence." "Like you're just not going to call the cops the second I leave here," he said. "We won't. I promise," she said, pausing for a bit. "Please." Benny, for the first time, took his eyes off Ron for a sustained period. He looked into Heather's bluish-gray eyes, seeing her pleading face. Ron saw what would be his only opportunity to possibly take Benny off guard and rip the gun from his hands, but chose not to take it, putting his faith in Heather. The room stayed still, with only the sounds of their heavy breathing filling it. After some time of this stillness, Benny shook his head, looking disgusted at this whole situation. However, he slowly holstered his gun and walked towards the front door. "Whatever," he said. "Anything he does now, it's all because of you, not because of me." He left out the front door and slammed it behind him. The sounds of the yellow sedan that had followed them all the way here started up and drove off into the street in a hurry. Once this happened, Ron almost collapsed back into the kitchen chair, his legs now wobbly from how much he had tried to hide their shakiness. Heather grabbed at her waist and sat down next to Ron, also looking like she had been staving off a spell herself. Ron eyed this. "Are you okay? You need me to call anyone?" he asked. "No, I'm fine. It's just gonna come and go here and there." He sighed. He pushed aside what had just happened to them and instead asked, "Given how much you knew about Bart's condition," he started, "it must be safe to say you were in that neighborhood when the water got contaminated too." She looked up at him surprised, almost guilty, as if she had been trying her absolute hardest to keep this a secret from him. She nodded. "It's true," she said. "I'm probably not long for this world, given my declining health." "It doesn't have to be this way." Ron rustled through his other jacket pocket and pulled out the other bottle of pills. He put it down and slid it across the table to her. Her eyes stared at this with confusion. "Is this?" she asked. "Amrita," he said. "I had 2 bottles of the trial version. One I gave to Bart, and now the other I'll give to you if you want to try it. Consider it a thank you for saving my hide just now." She stared at it. Then she looked back up at Ron. She slowly slid it back across the table to him. "There's no need to thank me. You saved my life too." "That's not the same thing. That was the reason you were in any danger." "Either way," she said, "I don't want it right now. Could you hold on to it for now? This place is a bit of a mess, and I'm worried I'd lose it." Ron chuckled, looking around the house with several projects that Darren left unfinished. He got up and finally poured the kettle into 2 mugs with the tea bags in them, and brought them to the table. Heather looked panicked as he set them down, and quickly grabbed 2 coasters from the edge of the table to slide underneath both of them. Ron just smiled and shook his head at her. He picked up the bottle and put it back in his pocket. "Very well, Miss Heather. As you wish." A couple weeks had passed. In this time, Ron carved more and more time out of his schedule to see Heather, much to the frustration of his colleagues on the Amrita team. Ron had explained the incident away as a cyber attack, a disgruntled ex-employee with all the right access and know-how to sabotage the project. The team was in a bit of disarray as they tried to salvage the project, and found it surprising that their boss was in such good spirits, despite the setbacks. Now, Ron was in his penthouse kitchenette. He was fiddling with a pasta maker he had bought just a few days before. He was attempting to figure out exactly how it worked as he continued measuring the ingredients he needed to use it. This was made all the more challenging by him having a conversation on the phone at the same time. "Ronnie," Lisa's voice said on speaker, "it's been over a month since you've taken me out or done anything with me." "I don't know what to tell you," he said. "Work's been busy." "You're lying to me. I bet you've been taking Natasha out places. I knew I never should have introduced you to her." Ron chuckled. "I haven't seen her longer than I've seen you." "Then who are you seeing?" she asked. "Enough of this. I want to see you right now. You send that driver of yours over to my place and have him pick me up right now." Ron paused as he just about finished screwing the attachment into his stand mixer. He looked down at the phone, a look of curiosity overtaking him. "Lisa," he said. "What's my driver's name?" "What? It was like some foreign-sounding name. Lohit? Johan? I don't know. Who cares, Ronnie? He's just your driver." Ron's jaw almost dropped. "You've been in that car how many times with me, and you don't even know his name? How about you don't call back until you do?" He then hung up the phone and grabbed the balls of pasta dough that he had rolled up. He shook his head. He was never of the delusion that Lisa genuinely liked him for anything other than his money. However, it was still a shock to learn that she was so self-centered that she felt in a class above someone so much that she felt it unnecessary to learn their name. He could try with all his might, and he could never imagine Heather doing something half as egocentric. Even Ron, despite the flaws he knew of himself, cared to learn the names of people who did things for him. His phone rang again. His hands were dirty from the dough, so he swiped to answer with his nose. "You better have that name now," he said. "Name?" the voice on the other end asked. It's Wes Stevenson, sir." The often disheveled lead researcher on Amrita was the one who called, on the other end, not Lisa. Sorry, Mr. Stevenson, he said. I didn't check to see who was calling. I thought someone was calling me back. I do know your name. I would never work with someone this long without knowing their name. Okay, Wes said. Anyway, I was just calling with the Friday update for you since you had to skip out on the meeting. Ron checked the time. It was almost 6:30. Good grief, Wes, he said. Don't you have a family to get home to? I don't, sir. I have friends. We were going to play video games tonight, but that's not until 8. Ron looked somewhat critically at his phone. Before he could say anything, Wes continued. Anyway, as I said last week, many of the trial candidates are claiming to have lost their supply of Amrita when we tried to reclaim it. We assume they think it's already proven to be working and are taking it in hopes of claiming immortality. We have managed to secure one bottle of it for our attempts to reverse engineer it. Ron rolled out his dough, while still listening. I thought we had coated the pills in a proprietary solution to prevent anyone from cracking the formula by reverse engineering. We did, sir, Wes said. But it's still the closest thing we've got, as the research we filed with the agency for the trial is riddled with misdirection, so between the two and my own memory, I think this is the only way we're going to piece together what we had. We filed misleading research to the drug agency? Why on earth did we do that? Ron thought back to Benny, who probably saw through this moment as it hit his desk. Wes sounded exasperated on the other end. You told us to do this, he said. Early on in the project, you said to... Ron's doorbell rang. He ran to wash his hands as quickly as he could to answer it. Sorry, Mr. Stevenson, we'll have to chat later. He hung up the phone and finished drying his hands. He checked his reflection in the view of his chrome fridge. His hair was a little messy, and he made his best attempt to fix it while he could. He scowled a little looking at his reflection. He remained unsure of the decision to do away with his mustache, but there was nothing he could do about it now. He ran over to the door and opened it to see Heather. She was wearing a nice black and white dress with a floral pattern across it. Ron had never seen her dressed up so nicely before, but despite this, she looked so natural. Hi, so sorry I'm late, she said. Ron bit his lip. She was only about 5 minutes late. He had been banking on her being later than usual to have time to prepare everything. 5 minutes late is on time in my book, he said. What do you have there? She held up a tin of cookies and smiled. It was the type of smile that drew Ron's eyes right to it. It made her whole face seem to light up, and in this moment he was briefly distracted from what he originally asked about. You said I could pick and make dessert, so I made some chocolate chip cookies. I used dark chocolate chips for them. Ron smirked. Well, of course. That's just the right way to make them. Heather walked in and set the cookies down on the counter. Ron closed the door behind her and scratched his head as he looked on at the unfinished scene in the kitchen. I'm running a little behind schedule, he said. But don't worry, it won't be too much longer. I can help you, she said. She ran over to the kitchen to start washing her hands. But I was going to prove to you that I can cook for myself after all, he said. You seem to doubt it. She smirked. I was just teasing. Besides, it's fun to cook together. What do you need? I can measure stuff or start working on the sauce. He looked at her and put his hands on his hips. She seemed so cheery and excited to be here. He thought how different this was from their first meeting at Alapocus Bakery all those weeks ago. Back then, she was quiet and had so little to say to anyone. Now, just a few days ago, she called to tell him about a dog she saw while walking and stretched it into a 30-minute conversation. At points, she did not even say anything for whole minutes at a time, which baffled Ron. He understood, though, that this was just who she was, someone who enjoyed the company of people she was comfortable with, and someone who enjoyed doing things together. He would be lying if he said he did not feel the same way about her. Sure, let's get you started on the sauce, he said. Can you chop about a cup of onions for me? He slid her one across the counter. He took his pasta dough and started to run it through the pasta-making attachment. He took the long strands of pasta and hung them on a rack while he went to roll out more of it. He turned to see Heather, looking quite nervous over the onion. Is something wrong? Is the condition acting up? He asked. She turned to him, looking embarrassed. Onions really make my eyes water. I'm not sure I can do this. Can we switch? Ron hung his head down and started laughing. She pouted at him. Sure, he said. Come get the pasta ready then. He went over and started chopping the onions. She moved back and forth throughout the kitchen as she made the pasta. He went to discard the ends of the onion and whatever he was not using, but she was standing right in front of the trash can as she seemed to ponder something. After a while, she noticed him. Sorry, she said, moving out of the way. Ron discarded the unused onions and then turned back to see her standing right in front of where he left the bowl, looking at something. He cleared his throat a bit. She jumped a little. Sorry, she said again. He just shook his head and went back over. He was not used to sharing a kitchen space while he worked, and almost found himself getting a little irritated. He stopped himself, though. When he was level-headed about this, he thought of just how lucky he was to have someone who genuinely cared about him, making food with him. He would rather have her in his way than anyone else stay out of his way. That was what he thought, as he turned to try to sneak a quick glance of her pretty face. To his surprise, she was wiping tears from her eyes. "Are you sure nothing's wrong?" he asked. "No, it's not that," she said, pointing to the onions. "Just from standing in front of them for a few seconds?" "I don't know. They really just get me, man," she said, starting to laugh. He continued to put the ingredients for the sauce together as he started to boil the water for the pasta. He grated some cheese up until the point that he had enough. When he went to put the grater in the sink, he turned to see Heather staring at the cheese. He smirked to himself. He walked back over, picked up a long strand, and gave it to her. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." He smiled as she quickly ate it and looked delighted with herself. He put the ingredients for the sauce together and started mixing them together before putting them in a pan. As he got the pan going, he turned to see her with half a cookie in her mouth, and the other half outstretched to him. He snatched it and ate the other half. She had to bring a hand to her mouth as she giggled slightly. They finished up cooking, and by around 7:30, they were finally ready to sit down and eat. They sat at the elegant dining table and ate their meal. Despite not having too much to say throughout it, Ron was surprised by the way that time just seemed to slip away from him when he was with her. Eventually, towards the end, as he was just about done, he let out a satisfied sigh. "Well, I think pasta night was a big success. I think next time we should make gnocchi." Heather finished chewing and responded, "Gnocchi." He tilted his head. "What?" "It's pronounced gnocchi. I'm sorry, I don't know why I always have to do that." Ron shrugged. "I don't know what you mean by that. I'm glad you tell me if I say something wrong. Do you know how dull it would be to just be surrounded by people who pretend you're right when you're wrong?" Heather chuckled. "I guess it would be." The two finished up eating and put their dishes in the sink. She looked up at him and smiled. "I would love to stay longer, but I do have a lot of papers to grade." "Of course. Let me walk you out. Rohan should be right across the street." The two went down into the elevator and walked out of the garage and along the street. There was no one coming either way, but all the same, Ron stopped at the crosswalk with Heather. She smiled at him. She had hardly stopped smiling since dinner, which Ron knew was not how she normally was. This made him very happy in turn. He stuck out his arm, and she held on to it as they crossed the street together. He went over and opened the door to the car for her, when he suddenly felt her nearly collapse onto the ground and barely managed to hold her up. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked her. She struggled to pull herself back up to her feet, still holding on to him for support. But each time she tried, she winced and seemed to collapse back down. She looked up at him, the beautiful smile now displaced by an expression of deep sadness and concern. This isn't like normal," she said. "I think I need to go to the hospital." Thank you so much for listening to this chapter of The Immortal Love. If you enjoyed, please rate the podcast, give it a like on YouTube, or share with someone else who you think might also enjoy. You can stay up to date with The Immortal Love by following us on social media. That'll be D Squared Stories on just about any of the major platforms. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to have you listen again next week.